Picture this. It's late 1812, and Napoleon's Grande is somewhere deep inside Russia. Snow is falling, wind is cutting like knives, and soldiers are shivering so hard their teeth sound like castanets in an orchestra of misery. You might imagine that the world's most feared military machine would be wrapped up in snug, warm coats, ready to outlast whatever the Russian winter could throw at them. But no. In one of history's finest examples of logistical face-planting, many of these men were wearing something so poorly made, so thin, and so pitiful, that calling it a greatcoat feels like an insult to both words. The French army called them capotes. On paper they sounded finer, long overcoat made of wool, designed to be layered over the soldier's uniform, offering protection from wind and cold. But when you touched one, you could tell it wasn't the kind of wool you'd want anywhere near Siberia. We're not talking about dense, tightly woven cloth that traps heat. This was coarse, loosely woven wool, think more cheap picnic blanket than military-grade winter armor. If you held it up to the light, you could probably see through the gaps in the weave. And yet, this was supposed to be the first and last line of defense between a soldier, skin, and temperatures dropping far below freezing. The problem wasn't just quality, it was also quantity. Napoleon's army at the start of the Russian campaign was massive, with over 600,000 men. Outfitting that many bodies for the bitter cold would have been a challenge for any army, even if they had started months in advance. But the French didn't stockpile enough capotes for everyone, whether it was overconfidence, poor planning, or just plain ignorance about what Russian winters were actually like. The result was simple. Not every soldier got one, and the ones who did sometimes found their protection falling apart before winter had even reached its worst. Some of these greatcoats were made under contract by suppliers who were more interested in meeting deadlines than meeting quality standards. Imagine being a textile mill owner in 1812, handed an urgent order for tens of thousands of wool coats, and knowing that you'd get paid the same whether the wool was thick and warm or thin and scratchy. The temptation to cut corners would have been huge. Many contractors used inferior wool or wove it with loose threads to save time and materials. The French supply officers, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of goods needed, often failed to check the quality carefully. So when the crates of capotes arrived at distribution points, they might look fine folded up, but in reality, they were barely fit for a damp autumn in Paris, let alone a Russian blizzard. Now, imagine being a soldier lucky enough to be issued one of these questionable coats. It might keep you warm while you were marching at least, as long as you kept moving and generating heat. But the moment you stopped, the thin wool stopped working. The cold seeped in through the loose weave. The wind sliced through it like paper. If snow landed on your shoulders, it melted slightly from your body heat and then froze again into a crust of ice. You could wear extra layers underneath, sure, but only if you had them. And many soldiers didn't. And remember, many soldiers didn't even get a coat in the first place. Some had to rely entirely on their standard uniform jackets, which were never meant for extreme cold. The French infantry coat, or habit vest, was made of lighter wool, cut short in the front for marching convenience. It worked in the temperate climates of Central Europe, but in Russia it was a recipe for frostbite. Without a greatcoat, a soldier's only other options were makeshift trapping themselves in blankets, scavenging furs from villagers, or even taking coats from dead comrades or enemies. Yes, battlefield recycling became a grim but necessary survival tactic. The shortage of proper greatcoats also made it harder to keep troops healthy. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Men who couldn't keep warm during long marches or while resting were more likely to suffer frostbite, hypothermia, and illness. Fingers and toes blackened, feet froze inside boots. Some soldiers had to march with stiff, frozen legs, because stopping to rest meant risking death from the cold. If you've ever seen a frozen chicken in a supermarket freezer, you've ever got the right image, except these were living men trying to keep moving to avoid becoming statues in the snow. Part of the problem came from Napoleon's own attitude toward logistics. He had a well-earned reputation for moving fast, striking hard, and relying on speed to win campaigns. But speed came at the cost of preparation. In France, the quartermaster corps had warned that more winter clothing and supplies would be needed. Napoleon brushed off some of those concerns. He assumed the campaign would be over quickly, that the Russian army would engage him in a decisive battle before the worst of winter hit. In his mind, the war would be wrapped up before anyone had to fight in temperatures cold enough to freeze brandy in your cup. This wasn't just optimism, it was the kind of miscalculation that belongs in the dumb historian Hall of Fame. Even when it became clear that winter was setting in, the supply chain was too slow to respond. The French supply lines in Russia were stretched hundreds of miles long, with wagons bogged down in mud, stuck in snow. or intercepted by Cossack raids. Any shipment of new greatcoats from France or depots further west had to survive weeks of hazardous travel before reaching the front. By the time the supplies arrived, if they arrived at all, it was often too late for many of the men who had needed them most. There's a cruel irony here. The French army was famous for its uniform style. Soldiers marched in neat ranks wearing tailored coats in the emperor's colors, polished buttons, and proper headgear. But when the Russian winter took hold, style went out the window. Soldiers ditched regulation rules and wore anything that could keep them alive. Fur hats taken from civilians, sheepskin coats ripped from abandoned farms, or patched-together cloaks made from rugs. Some soldiers looked more like wandering beggars than the pride of the French Empire. Of course, not everyone suffered equally. Officers who had more personal resources and status often managed to get better quality coats or furs, sometimes purchased privately before the campaign began. Some even sent for supplies from home. This created a stark contrast on the battlefield. Officers riding in heavy cloaks lined with fur, and rank-and-file soldiers shuffling along in threadbare capotes that flapped in the wind. Nothing like a bit of class inequality to make freezing to death feel even more personal. The poor quality of the greatcoats wasn't just a comfort issue, it affected the army's fighting ability. Cold soldiers march slower. Cold soldiers can't handle their weapons as well because their fingers stiffen. Cold soldiers are more likely to desert or fall behind. A soldier wrapped in inadequate wool, teeth chattering, is not going to be in top shape when enemy cavalry comes charging. And once frostbite set in, the army started losing men without a single musket being fired. The Russian winter was acting like an invisible enemy, one that attacked without warning, struck everyone, and couldn't be driven off by force. And so, as the retreat from Moscow began, the coat problem became a coat catastrophe. Temperatures plunged to extremes that made the poor quality wool practically useless. At night, when men camped in the open, the capotes turned into stiff, frozen shells. In the mornings, soldiers had to break the ice off their own clothing before they could move. Those without coats were even worse off, huddling together for warmth like penguins, except penguins are better dressed for the cold. Some soldiers resorted to wrapping themselves in raw animal hides taken from freshly slaughtered horses. Messy, smelly, but better than nothing. The French weren't the first army to be caught unprepared for a Russian winter, and they wouldn't be the last. But in this case, the Greatcoat Fiasco was one of many small but crucial factors that turned a bold invasion into a slow-motion disaster. Poor planning, shoddy materials, and wishful thinking about the weather combined to create a situation where thousands of men froze not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked a decent piece of clothing. And that's the ridiculous part. Napoleon's empire spanned most of Europe. His armies could bring down kingdoms, redraw maps, and terrify their enemies. Yet here they were undone, in part by a failure to get enough thick wool sewn into coats. It's the kind of detail that makes you shake your head, because history often turns on things so small and stupid, you do think they belonged in a comedy sketch rather than a history book. If you're picturing this in your head, an army of hardened veterans, world beaters in battle, reduced to stealing rugs and wearing them like cloaks while their breath froze in the air, not far off from the truth. The French were defeated, not just by the Russian army, but by the Russian weather, and in that fight, a bad coat is as good as no coat at all. Napoleon's Russian disaster wasn't just about one decisive battle that went wrong or a brilliant Russian counteroffensive. It was a disaster of logistics. At first, Napoleon's army moved too fast for its own good. The supply wagons trailed behind, struggling to cross rivers and avoid getting stuck in the mud. Every day the distance between the front lines and the supplies grew wider. Soldiers at the front ran out of bread, meat, and even basic gear like nails for shoe repairs or gunpowder for their muskets. Napoleon had planned to have depots, big storage points along the way, but his rapid pace meant these depots were often days behind where the soldiers actually were. In other words, the supplies were there, but they might as well have been on the moon. The Russians were not sitting idle either. They used a scorched earth strategy, which meant they burned crops, destroyed food stores, and evacuated livestock before the French could get to them. This made living off the land a complete joke. A French soldier might march all day toward a village hoping for bread and hay, only to find smoking ruins and empty wells. When you're feeding hundreds of thousands of men and animals, one burned field is bad, but hundreds of burned fields are a death sentence. This problem snowballed quickly. With less food, soldiers began slaughtering their horses for meat, but those horses were also needed to pull supply wagons. Fewer horses meant slower wagons, and slower wagons meant even less food at the front. It was a downward spiral. The army's ability to move and fight was literally being eaten away. Imagine trying to run a marathon where the water stations keep getting farther apart, and the people in front of you keep smashing the cups before you arrive. Winter hadn't even started, and already men were breaking down. Malnutrition made soldiers weaker and more likely to get sick. Dysentery and typhus spread through the camps, killing thousands before a single musket ball reached them. Officers who were used to commanding crisp, disciplined troops now had to deal with starving, desperate men who were more interested in raiding a potato patch than following orders. Napoleon's Grande was starting to look less like a precision war machine and more like a massive, hungry mob. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to talk about one man who really embodied this collapse. General Victor Hubert, Count de Bourg. And no, he's not related to that other famous guy from Beauty and the Beast. Anyway, this guy started the war as Napoleon's right-hand man. He was popular with the troops, and most importantly, he was good at logistics. He was basically in charge of feeding, arming, and shoeing the entire army. And when the Russians retreated after the Battle of Smolensk, Bonaparte got his chance to shine. With an army that big, there's a lot of mouths to feed, and so far, things weren't going too badly. There were supply dumps set up every 20 miles along the route, and if the soldiers were quick enough, they could grab what they needed and be on their way. But then everything went wrong. First, the Russians destroyed the bridges over the Volga River. That meant evacuating thousands of wounded soldiers, plus baggage carts and artillery, all by boat. So far, so logistical. But while everyone waited around for the crossings, well, they got hungry. Those supply depots weren't exactly close to the front lines, so everyone got pretty hungry, very fast. Bread rations dropped to £0.5 per person per day, and officers who tried to hand out extra rations got punished for stealing. Add to that a few hot, sunny days, and you get a recipe for total chaos. By the time the pontoons were finally finished, soldiers were so desperate for food that they ate grass, leaves, frogs, and mice. And it wasn't uncommon to see men fighting over a dead cat. After all that, when they finally reached the supply depot, they found that most of the food had gone bad. Hay had molded, barrels had burst, and rats had made a big comeback. Things were bad, like really bad. If you wanted to get a new canteen or musket, your chances were better at the roulette table. Still, something good did come out of this. A new phrase in the English language, beat a dead horse. No, seriously, this story actually inspired the song The Trooper by Iron Maiden. You can listen to it here. And when they learned how bad things really were, even the band said, whoa, hold on. Anyway, back to the story. With his reputation in tatters, Bourbon decided to take extreme measures. He wrote a memo to Napoleon asking for permission to punish anyone stealing food or forage with hard labor in the military prisons. But Napoleon wasn't having it. Stealing was technically desertion, and deserters were usually put to death. Just before leaving for Russia, Napoleon told his marshals there should be no leniency shown to pillagers, deserters, or those who have thrown away their arms. As it turned out, that policy came back to bite him in the backside. While Bonaparte tried to fix the supply issue, another disaster struck. Rain. There was so much rain. Even the sturdiest supply wagons struggled to stay upright, let alone carry a full load. All across the Russian landscape, wagons were sinking in the mud, and whole convoys were wiped out by swollen rivers. And when the rain stopped, the sun came out and everything dried up. Suddenly, the river crossings were impassable and the wagons were stuck in the mud. What followed has become legendary, maybe because it's partly true and partly myth, like most legends. Whatever the case, it became known as the October Catastrophe. Over several days, tens of thousands of supply wagons, mostly carrying food, were lost to the mud, rain, and the sun. With the supply line completely broken, Napoleon had no choice but to order his armies to live off the land. Unfortunately, as we already mentioned, the Russians had taken most of the land with them, while the Grande rum family farms, empty fields and cemeteries. Remember, this was during the winter. Snow fell and temperatures plummeted. Soldiers without proper clothing froze at night. The ones who didn't freeze developed severe cases of trench foot, where their boots were so tight from soaking wet socks that they couldn't walk. It was bad. In one camp, an officer wrote, "I have seen 6 or 7 men lying in one hole, 2 dead and the others dying. One of them turned to me, raised his finger to heaven, and exclaimed, 'Oh, that villain of a Bonaparte, he's going to kill us all.' Then he expired in my arms." Another soldier wrote home, "Our situation is pitiful. We must eat straw and roots. The cattle are all gone. The peasants have long since fled. We killed a horse and divided it among the 4 of us. The officers gave us some brandy. Without that, we could not have endured the intense cold. On top of that, typhus was spreading, killing thousands upon thousands of men. By the end of December, the Grande was less than half its original strength." Napoleon knew he had to turn things around or his army would collapse entirely. His solution was to retreat to Poland, where he figured he could resupply and start over from there. Sadly, the army wasn't capable of marching, let alone fighting. Napoleon ended up spending Christmas with his headquarters staff, desperately trying to figure out how to save his army, his prestige, or at least both. What he came up with is probably one of the craziest plans in military history. Stay tuned to find out why. One haunting image from the retreat is that of soldiers walking past frozen bodies, sometimes friends, sometimes strangers, knowing they couldn't stop to help because they'd freeze too. In some cases, men took boots or coats from the dead just to survive a few more days. It was survival in its rawest, ugliest form, and it all traced back to a supply system that had completely collapsed. The French army that had marched into Russia in the summer looked nothing like the one that limped back into Poland in December. Of the hundreds of thousands who had set out, only a fraction made it home. Most of them didn't die in grand battles. They died in ditches, on frozen roads, or in the wreckage of burned villages. All because the basic needs of an army had been ignored or underestimated. Napoleon had fought and won campaigns before in Italy, Austria, and Prussia, but in each of those cases, the distances were shorter, the infrastructure better, and the land richer in supplies. Russia was a different beast entirely. Its size, its climate, and its poor roads made it a logistical nightmare, and yet Napoleon pressed forward as if he was still in Central Europe, confident that speed and boldness would carry the day. Instead, speed just outpaced the food, the coats, and the ammunition. Boldness turned into overreach. What's almost comically of it, weren't he so tragicies that Napoleon's downfall here wasn't he some secret Russian superweapon or brilliant battlefield trap. It was bread. It was warm clothing. It was keeping horses alive. These are problems as old as warfare itself, and yet they were allowed to spiral out of control until they destroyed one of the most powerful armies in history. In the end, the master strategist was beaten by the same thing that can ruin any camping trip: not bringing enough supplies and going way too far from home. When Napoleon began his invasion of Russia in 1812, he believed it would be swift and decisive. His generals shared that belief. They thought they could crush the Russian armies in a few weeks, forced Tsar Alexander I to negotiate, and return home before the leaves started to turn. In their minds, the campaign would resemble Napoleon's earlier victories in Europe: fast marches, short battles, and quick peace treaties. But this thinking ignored the most dangerous factors of all: distance, climate, and an enemy that refused to fight on Napoleon's terms. Napoleon had reason to be confident. For over a decade, he had dominated the European battlefield. His Grande was one of the largest and most experienced forces in history, numbering over 600,000 soldiers from across the French Empire and its allies. His rapid campaigns in Austria, Prussia, and Italy had proven that speed and concentration of force could overwhelm even well-trained opponents. Napoleon saw no reason Russia would be different. He pictured the Russians making a stand somewhere near the border, losing a decisive battle, and then surrendering. This was how his wars usually worked. The problem was that Russia was not Austria, and it was not Prussia. Russia was bigger than anything Napoleon had faced, and the Russians were not interested in playing his game. The Russian strategy from the start was to avoid giving Napoleon the battle he wanted. Instead of defending every inch of territory, they pulled back, burning crops, destroying supplies, and leaving nothing useful behind. This was the scorched earth tactic, and it hit Napoleon's army in ways he had not prepared for. The farther his troops marched into Russia, the more stretched their supply lines became. Wagons carrying food and ammunition had to cover hundreds of miles, often on muddy, rutted roads. Horses died from exhaustion, wagons broke down, and soldiers went hungry. Napoleon's army was designed for fast, decisive operations, not a slow pursuit across endless open plains. Still, Napoleon believed the Russians would eventually stop and fight. He thought pride or politics would force them to defend a major city. In a way, he was right. The Russians finally fought at Borodino in September, near Moscow, but even this was not the decisive knockout Napoleon expected. The battle was brutal. with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. But the Russian army withdrew in good order. Napoleon occupied Moscow, but the city was largely abandoned and soon burned. There was no surrender, no treaty, and no sign that the war was ending. Napoleon had reached his goal, yet his victory was meaningless. He was hundreds of miles from his supply bases. Winter was approaching, and the Russian army was still intact. Here is where overconfidence turned into a strategic disaster. Napoleon had not planned for a long stay in Russia. His army carried no winter uniforms, no extra food for the months ahead, and no reliable way to replace what they had lost. In the past, his armies had lived off the land, taking supplies from the territory they conquered. But in Russia, there was little to take. Entire villages had been emptied and burned before the French arrived. Livestock had been driven away. Fields were blackened stubble. His troops could not feed themselves the traditional way, and the supply wagons from the west were arriving slower each week. Some of Napoleon's generals recognized the danger early. They warned him that pushing too far into Russia would risk the destruction of the army. But Napoleon's confidence in his own judgment, built on years of success, made him dismiss these fears. He believed the Russians were on the verge of collapse and that one more push would break them. This mindset blinded him to the fact that the Russians were winning without winning battles. Every mile the French advanced was a mile farther from home, and every day spent waiting for a Russian surrender was another day of dwindling supplies. When the decision finally came to leave Moscow in mid-October, it was already too late. The first snow fell soon after the retreat began. Temperatures dropped rapidly, and soldiers without proper clothing began to freeze during the night. Horses collapsed in the cold, and without horses, artillery pieces and supply wagons had to be abandoned. Men marched for hours without food, and those who fell behind were left for dead. Russian cavalry and Cossack raiders attacked stragglers, picking off smaller groups. The retreat became a nightmare. Thousands died not in battle, but from starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. The scale of Napoleon's miscalculation becomes clear when you consider the distances involved. From the French-controlled territories in Poland to Moscow was roughly 600 miles. That's the equivalent of marching from Paris to Berlin and then to Warsaw, all without reliable railways or motor vehicles. Napoleon's supply system was stretched far beyond its limits. In modern military terms, his logistics tale was unsustainable. He had assumed that speed and momentum would make up for the lack of deep preparation. But in Russia, speed was the one thing the enemy would never give him. Imagine if Napoleon had treated Russia like he treated Egypt during his 1798 campaign. In Egypt, he brought scientists, engineers, and stockpiles of supplies, preparing for a long stay. But in Russia, he marched as if he were going to fight a summer war in Bavaria. If he had prepared for winter, bringing warm clothing, secure supply depots, and perhaps choosing to winter in a captured city while keeping his army in good condition, he might have avoided disaster. But preparation requires time, money, and patience, and Napoleon's confidence made him believe none of that was necessary. One of the clearest signs of overconfidence was the way Napoleon dismissed the weather as a serious threat. He believed that his campaign would be over before the Russian winter could start. This belief was not based on ignorance. He knew Russian winters were harsh, but on the assumption that his military genius would end the war quickly. This is a dangerous form of overconfidence, underestimating a known threat because you believe it will not have time to matter. When winter did arrive, it became an enemy just as deadly as the Russian army. Frostbite, disease, and hunger killed more men than musket fire or cannon shot. The overconfidence also showed in how Napoleon managed his alliances. Grande was not entirely French. It included soldiers from Italy, Germany, Poland, and other parts of the empire. Many of these men had no personal stake in the war with Russia, and their loyalty depended on the belief that Napoleon could lead them to victory. As conditions worsened, morale collapsed, desertion increased, discipline broke down, and the army's unity dissolved. Napoleon had assumed that his charisma and record of success would keep the army together through any hardship. He learned, too late, that hunger and cold can break even the most loyal troops. By the time the remnants of the Grande staggered back across the Berezina River in November, Napoleon had lost the majority of his soldiers. Of the over 600,000 who had crossed into Russia in June, fewer than 100,000 returned in fighting condition. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. This was more than a military defeat, was a collapse caused by a chain of bad assumptions, each built on the foundation of overconfidence. The belief in a short war had led to weak logistics, poor planning for the climate, and a refusal to retreat early when the situation was still recoverable. Napoleon's Russian campaign is a case study in how strategic miscalculations can destroy even the most powerful army. Victory in past wars had given him a false sense of invincibility. He had forgotten that the enemy also gets a say in how a war is fought. The Russians refused to meet him in the kind of battle he excelled at, and instead fought on their own terms. By the time Napoleon realized the nature of the war he was in, the conditions had already turned against him. If you've been enjoying this deep dive into Napoleon's disastrous miscalculations, don't forget to subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories about history's biggest blunders. Sometimes, the past is the best teacher, especially when it shows how even the smartest leaders can make the biggest mistakes. When Napoleon's Grand Army marched into Russia in 1812, they expected a decisive battle, quick victory, and the glory of returning home with their heads held high. Instead, they found themselves trapped in one of the harshest campaigns in military history. One of the main reasons for this disaster was the Russian military's use of the scorched earth policy, a brutal but effective method of depriving the enemy of everything they could possibly use to survive. This strategy was not about winning a battle on a single field. It was about making the very land itself into a weapon. The idea behind scorched earth is simple in theory but devastating in practice. As you retreat, you burn and destroy anything that could help your enemy. You tear down bridges, destroy supply depots, kill livestock, and torch fields so there is nothing left to eat. You even burn houses, barns, and mills, so the enemy can't take shelter or find materials for fuel or clothing. It's a policy meant to starve, freeze, and exhaust the invader long before they can force you into a decisive engagement. In 1812, the Russians used this tactic with ruthless consistency, and it played a huge role in breaking Napoleon's invasion. To understand why the Russians resorted to such an extreme method, you have to look at the size and strength of Napoleon's army. The Grand Army numbered over 600,000 soldiers at the start of the campaign, one of the largest forces ever assembled in European history. It included troops from across the French Empire and its allies, from Italy to Poland to the Netherlands. Feeding and supplying such a massive force was a logistical nightmare. In normal campaigns, armies relied on a mix of their own supply lines and what they could take from the land they marched through: food from farms, forage for horses, and shelter in local towns. This method worked well in the fertile lands of Central Europe, where villages and granaries could be seized to keep the army moving. But in Russia, the French quickly found that nothing of value was left standing in their path. From the very beginning, as Napoleon advanced deeper into Russian territory, the retreating Russian army stripped the countryside bare. Villages were evacuated, grain stores burned, wells poisoned or filled in, and livestock driven away or slaughtered. Sometimes, Russian peasants themselves burned their own homes rather than let the French use them. Imagine being a French soldier marching through miles of empty land, seeing only the blackened remains of farmhouses and smoking fields. There is no bread to eat, no hay for the horses, and no barns to sleep in when the nights grow cold. The army's long supply lines, stretching back into Europe, became more and more strained. The French had counted on living off the land to supplement their rations, but the land itself had been turned into an empty wasteland. By midsummer, the effects of this strategy were already being felt. Horses began to die in large numbers, not from battle wounds, but from hunger and exhaustion. Without horses, moving artillery and supply wagons became harder. Soldiers who could no longer get their usual bread and meat rations had to survive on whatever they could find: roots, unripe grain, even strips of leather boiled into a kind of soup. Disease began to spread in the weakened army. Napoleon had not yet fought a major battle, but the Russian scorched earth tactic was already cutting his army down. The burning of Smolensk in August 1812 was one of the most dramatic examples of this policy. Smolensk was an important city on the road to Moscow, and Napoleon hoped to capture it intact to use as a supply base. But the Russians refused to let it fall into French hands in usable condition. They set fire to much of the city before retreating. When the French entered, they found a smoldering ruin with almost no food or shelter left. The French took the city, but it was useless for their needs. The victory was hollow. It did nothing to solve their growing supply crisis. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September, he found that the Russians had taken the scorched earth tactic to its extreme. The city was largely abandoned, and soon after the French arrived, massive fires broke out, destroying much of what was left. Whether the fires were deliberately set by the Russians or caused by accident is still debated by historians, but the result was the same. Napoleon had marched all the way to Moscow only to find that it offered no safe winter quarters, no massive stores of food, and no relief from the problem of dwindling supplies. For the Grand Army, the occupation of Moscow was not a turning point toward victory, it was the moment. They realized that the Russians were not going to surrender. By this time, the Russian winter was setting in. This was where the scorched earth policy became even more deadly. In a normal winter campaign, soldiers could at least take shelter in barns, use firewood from local houses, or improvise warm clothing from whatever they could find in towns. But the Russians had left nothing. As the French began their retreat, they had to march through open country with little or no shelter. Villages were gone, and forests had been stripped of usable wood. Even finding enough material to keep a fire going was a challenge. Without fuel, soldiers froze in their sleep. Without food, they collapsed in the snow. The lack of resources also meant they could not replace lost clothing. Many French soldiers entered Russia wearing summer uniforms and never found anything better by December. Frostbite was claiming as many lives as starvation. Think about what this meant on a personal level. Imagine a French grenadier in late November, his boots worn through, feet wrapped in rags, scavenged from the roadside. He hasn't had a full meal in days. The only shelter he finds at night is the side of a frozen ditch. His musket is heavy, but he carries it because leaving it behind means surrendering his place in the army. Snow falls quietly as he marches, but he knows that if he stops to rest for too long, he may never get back up. When the sun sets, the temperature and the cold becomes something physical, like a hand squeezing the life out of him. This was the reality created by the scorched earth policy. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical toll. Soldiers in Napoleon's army were used to decisive campaigns, quick movements, short battles, and clear victories. In Russia, they were forced into a slow death by exhaustion and deprivation. There was no single enemy to fight. Instead, the enemy was hunger, cold, and endless empty miles. The Russians avoided major confrontations until they were ready, striking only when the French were at their weakest. The Battle of Borodino, fought in early September, was the closest thing to a decisive engagement. But even that bloody clash failed to bring the French the quick victory they needed. The scorched earth policy was not without its costs to the Russians themselves. It meant sacrificing entire villages, crops, and livelihoods to stop Napoleon. Thousands of Russian civilians were displaced, and many faced starvation in the aftermath. But the Russian leadership understood that destroying their own resources was a lesser evil compared to letting Napoleon's massive army survive and strengthen itself on Russian soil. This was a war not just of soldiers, but of endurance, and the Russians knew their greatest ally was the land itself, if they could make it hostile enough to the invader. As the retreat dragged on, the French army disintegrated. By the time Napoleon's forces staggered back across the Berezina River in late November, the Grand Army was no longer grand. Out of the more than 500,000 men who had entered Russia, only a fraction made it back. Many were dead, others were captured. Countless more simply vanished into the snowy wastes. The Russians had fought battles, yes, but it was the scorched earth strategy that turned the invasion into a catastrophe. Napoleon's military genius could not overcome the complete destruction of his supply options. The lesson was cruelly simple. An army can only fight if it can eat, shelter, and clothe itself. Deprive it of those basic needs, and even the strongest force in Europe will crumble. The Russians did not need to win every battle, they only needed to deny the French the means to survive long enough to fight another one, and that's exactly what they did. If you're enjoying this kind of raw novel of history, then you'd probably like Dumb Historian, where we dive into the gritty details that most textbooks skip. So, if you want more stories about how history was shaped by stubborn people making ruthless choices, go hit that subscribe button. Napoleon's men might not have found food in Russia, but you can definitely find more history here. Napoleon's Grande was unlike anything Europe had seen before. At its peak, it swelled to over 600,000 men. To picture that, imagine the entire population of a large modern city, every man in it marching in formation, armed with muskets, swords, and cannons, all moving toward one destination. This wasn't just France's army. It was a mix of French veterans, newly recruited conscripts, and soldiers from Allied or occupied territories, Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, and even Spaniards. Together, they formed the largest military force Europe had ever seen. But the size that gave Napoleon an advantage on paper also created his greatest logistical nightmare. Feeding an army of that scale was like trying to keep a banquet going for hundreds of thousands of guests. Every single day, while constantly moving the table hundreds of miles away, the soldiers needed bread, meat, cheese, and sometimes dried beans or peas. Horses, which were just as important as men in a Napoleonic army, required fodder in huge quantities, hay, oats, and barley. The more the army moved into hostile territory, the less they could rely on local supplies. In France, the army could be fed from storehouses and farms arranged in advance. But in Russia, every step deeper into the countryside meant the soldiers were further from their home base, and the roads behind them became stretched supply lines vulnerable to attack or complete collapse. Clothing was another struggle. Soldiers marched in uniforms designed for European climates, not for the extremes of the Russian plains. At the start of the campaign in summer, wool coats felt unbearably hot, and many men threw theirs away during long, sweaty marches. When winter arrived, that discarded coat meant freezing nights with little more than a thin tunic and worn boots. Imagine standing guard in waist-deep snow, the wind cutting into your skin, with frost creeping into your fingers and toes until they turned black. Many men didn't survive that transition, not from enemy bullets, but from cold and disease. Napoleon's supply officers were brilliant planners by the standards of the day, but even the most efficient system couldn't keep up with such an enormous and mobile force. Wagons carried bread ovens, barrels of flour, and salted meat. Yet there were never enough wagons for the entire army. Roads in Russia were often just dirt tracks that turned to mud in rain and froze into jagged ice in winter. Wheels snapped, horses collapsed, and supplies spilled into the mire. If one convoy was delayed or destroyed, entire divisions could go days without proper rations. Hunger quickly became more dangerous than the enemy. Soldiers tried to make up for shortages by foraging, but that created its own problems. A unit ordered to live off the land would scatter into villages and farms, grabbing whatever food they could find, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. But the Russian scorched earth policy meant that peasants often burned their own grain and slaughtered their livestock rather than let the French have them. Foraging parties would return with nothing but a few potatoes or onions, while others never came back at all, caught by Cossack raiders. The army's size also slowed it down. In theory, Napoleon could move quickly by splitting his force into separate corps, each marching along different roads and then regrouping for battle. But the bigger the army, the more difficult it became to coordinate those movements over vast distances with only messengers on horseback. If one corps was delayed, the others might have to wait, eating through their supplies while the enemy prepared defenses. And when the whole army had to cross a river or pass through a narrow stretch of road, it created bottlenecks that could last for days. Morale suffered as a result. In the early stages, the Grande was confident, buoyed by Napoleon's string of victories. But as the campaign dragged on, rations grew smaller, uniforms wore thin, and the men's bodies weakened. Marching on an empty stomach under a blazing sun or in freezing wind sapped the will to fight. Letters home often spoke of hunger worse than battle, and comrades falling by the roadside, too weak to keep walking. Desertion increased, especially among the non-French troops, who had less personal loyalty to Napoleon and saw no reason to die in a foreign land for his empire. Weapons and ammunition were another part of the logistical struggle. Muskets required gunpowder, lead balls, and paper cartridges. Artillery pieces needed heavy iron shot and explosive shells, each weighing dozens of pounds. Moving thousands of cannons and millions of rounds across hundreds of miles of rough terrain demanded incredible effort. Horses pulling artillery teams required more food and rest than infantry, and when they died, the guns had to be abandoned. A cannon left behind in the mud was not just a loss of firepower, it was a blow to morale, a symbol that the army was faltering. Napoleon had built his reputation on speed and decisive battles. But in Russia, the size of his force made that style of warfare harder to execute. Smaller armies could live off the land, move quickly, and surprise the enemy. But a force of 600,000 was too big to feed without prepared supply lines, and too slow to hide its movements. The Russians took advantage, retreating rather than giving battle, drawing the French deeper into a land where the roads were bad, the towns were burned, and winter was always waiting. Even before the cold set in, disease was taking its toll. Dysentery spread through camps when clean water was scarce. Typhus, carried by lice, swept through the ranks. The sheer density of men, combined with poor sanitation, turned bivouacs into breeding grounds for sickness. A healthy man could be marching one week and lying in a shallow grave the next. The scale of the army meant that once disease took root, it could kill thousands before commanders even realized how bad it was. The Grande size was both its strength and its weakness. On the battlefield, Napoleon could overwhelm smaller forces with sheer numbers, but every advantage of numbers came with a hidden cost. More mouths to feed, more feet to shoe, more bodies to clothe, and more wagons to keep rolling. When the campaign began, it looked like an unstoppable juggernaut, but as the weeks passed, hunger, cold, disease, and exhaustion reduced its numbers far faster than enemy action. By the time the army turned back from Moscow, the once mighty host had become a desperate, ragged column, barely able to defend itself from constant harassment. If you picture the start of the campaign, you see neat ranks of men, uniforms crisp, banners bright, drums and fifes keeping rhythm. By the end, those same soldiers were gaunt, their boots wrapped in rags, their muskets rusting, their spirits broken. All of this came from one simple truth: the bigger the army, the harder it is to keep it alive. Napoleon's gamble in assembling such a force was that it would crush the enemy before the supply system collapsed. In Russia, the opposite happened. The supply system broke first, and the army collapsed with it. That est the thing about history, sometimes the downfall of a mighty empire, isn't decided by a glorious final charge, but by whether a soldier can get a warm meal and a dry pair of socks. And if you want more strange, human, and slightly ridiculous stories like this, subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we talk about the parts of history your textbooks never bothered to mention. The soldiers' march never seemed to end. Step after step, day after day, their feet carried them across miles of uneven ground, through soaked fields and narrow rutted roads. The ground shifted from loose dirt to thick mud, sometimes sucking at their boots with every step, sometimes scattering stones under their soles. Every march took its toll, and while the soldiers themselves grew tired, it was their clothing and footwear that bore the heaviest punishment. Most soldiers began the campaign with uniforms that were already far from new. In many armies of the time, supplies were scarce even before the first march began. A soldier might have only one set of clothes, one jacket, one pair of trousers, one shirt, and one pair of boots. The moment they stepped out for that first day's march, those clothes became their shield against weather and terrain. But with each day on the road, the shield wore thinner, fabric frayed at the seams, the thread holding patches together loosened until the patch itself dangled like a flap in the wind. Buttons snapped off, sometimes replaced with string, sometimes left undone entirely. The boots were another matter. The soles, often made from thick leather, were never designed for endless movement in wet conditions. Rain seeped in through tiny cracks and soaked the wool socks underneath. Soldiers found themselves walking for hours with feet that were not just wet but chilled to the bone. In some cases, the leather became so waterlogged that it softened and lost its shape. The heels wore down to nothing, forcing the soldier to walk awkwardly, which in turn caused pain in the legs and back. When the boots finally split open, there was rarely another pair waiting to replace them. A soldier might wrap strips of cloth around his feet to keep them in place or stuff the holes with straw, but these were desperate measures that never lasted long. The autumn weather made everything worse. Rain did not simply make the ground muddy, it turned the roads into long stretches of sludge. Mud clung to boots until they felt twice as heavy. Each step required more effort, pulling the boot free before setting it down again, only for it to sink back into the muck. When the soldiers finally stopped for the night, their boots were caked with filth, but without spare footwear, they often had to keep those boots on their feet overnight, letting the mud dry hard around them. By morning, the leather felt stiff, the soles even more worn, and the dampness never fully gone. Clothing faced the same relentless assault. Jackets became soaked through, and the damp wool smelled of mildew within days. Trousers tore easily at the knees from long marches or from stumbling in rough terrain. Shirts stuck to the skin, rubbed raw under the arms, and sometimes split open at the seams from constant movement. There were no field repair kits, and even if there were, soldiers often lacked the time or the dry conditions needed to use them. A man might carry a needle and a small spool of thread, but trying to sew in the rain or under the dim light of a campfire after a day's march was a near impossible task. Imagine a soldier who has been marching for a week straight, his boots now thin at the sole, his toes pressing directly against the cold ground through a small tear. His trousers have a rip along the thigh, and the fabric keeps catching on thorns and brush as he walks. His jacket's left sleeve has a tear near the elbow, letting rain soak his arm. There is no dry set of clothes waiting for him at night, only the same damp, grimy garments he wore that day. He sleeps in them because they are the only warmth he has. The next morning, he rises and marches again, each step wearing his uniform down a little more. The longer the march went on, the more the soldier's clothing began to resemble rags. Bright, neat uniforms, once meant to inspire pride, turned dull with stains and patches. Torn cuffs hung loose. The color faded under the constant wash of rain and the rubbing of mud. In many cases, soldiers resorted to scavenging from the dead or from abandoned supply carts. A fallen comrade's jacket might be stripped and worn, even if it was too big or too small. Ill-fitting clothing caused its own problems, rubbing blisters into the skin and restricting movement, but it was better than nothing. But armies on the move for long periods often saw their men slide into the same ragged, patchwork appearance. This was not just a matter of looks. Poor clothing and footwear could slow an army's advance, increase sickness, and reduce combat effectiveness. Every torn boot or soaked jacket was a small blow to the army's ability to function as a whole. Even in moments of rest, clothing remained an issue. Soldiers might hang their uniforms to dry, only to have the rain return before the fabric could lose its dampness. At night, if the temperature dropped, wet clothes stiffened, making it painful to put them back on in the morning. Some soldiers tried to sleep in their underclothes to keep their outer layers dry, but this left them more exposed to the cold while they slept. Others simply curled up in their uniforms, accepting that they would wake up as wet and cold as when they had fallen asleep. There are stories from various campaigns where soldiers became almost unrecognizable under the grime and tattered cloth of their uniforms. Officers sometimes had difficulty telling friend from foe until they were close enough to see the face. Clothing dyed from bright colors into muddy browns and grays made everyone look the same. In a way, the march stripped away the image of a proud, orderly army and replaced it with something more primal, a mass of men surviving in whatever scraps of cloth they could hold on to. For those who study history today, it's easy to overlook these details. We think of battles, strategies, and victories, but the everyday grind of marching was as decisive as any weapon. The destruction of clothing was not just an inconvenience, it shaped the health, morale, and survival of the army. Without the means to repair or replace what they wore, soldiers had to fight two wars at once, one against the enemy, and one against the slow, steady decay of the very gear meant to protect them. Napoleon Bonaparte entered the Russian campaign of 1812 with confidence built on years of military success. He had studied the terrain, considered the distances, and understood that Russian winters were cold, but he and his advisors believed they could complete the campaign before the worst of the weather arrived. Their timetable was based on the assumption that they would engage the Russian army in a decisive battle, defeat it quickly, and secure a favorable peace before the onset of deep winter. This belief proved fatal. What they failed to account for was the reality of the Russian climate, its unpredictability, its early onset in certain years, and its intensity. The winter of 1812 did not simply arrive as expected. It came weeks earlier than normal and brought temperatures that plunged to levels the French army had never faced. In the early planning stages, Napoleon and his staff expected that the campaign would be completed by late summer or early autumn. They assumed that after marching into Russia, they would force Tsar Alexander I to negotiate rather than retreat. They believed that the Russian army, having faced Napoleon's forces in the past, would not risk a prolonged war on their own soil. This expectation led to a fatal underestimation of the time needed for the campaign. In their minds, the army would be in comfortable winter quarters before the first snow fell. Instead, the Russians adopted a strategy of retreat and scorched earth. burning their own villages and supplies as they fell back, denying the French the resources they counted on. This forced Napoleon to push his men deeper into Russian territory than planned, extending the campaign into months when weather became a critical factor. The first signs of trouble came in late September. The nights grew colder much earlier than expected. Frost began forming on the ground while the army was still advancing toward Moscow. The French soldiers, many of whom came from milder climates in France, Italy, and Spain, noticed the change but assumed it was temporary. Their officers reassured them that the real cold would not set in until December, giving them enough time to complete their objectives and retreat to safe quarters. But by early October, temperatures were already dipping below freezing. Soldiers without adequate winter gear began to suffer. Frostbite cases appeared, and the march became slower as icy roads and frozen streams made movement more difficult. When Napoleon entered Moscow in mid-September, he expected to find supplies and shelter. Instead, he found a city abandoned by most of its residents and burning in many places, the result of deliberate fires set by the retreating Russians. Without shelter and food, the French army could not survive a long occupation. Napoleon hesitated, hoping for a peace offer from Alexander I, but none came. Every day spent in Moscow meant more supplies consumed and more exposure to the worsening weather. Finally, in mid-October, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. By then, the window for a safe withdrawal had already closed. The retreat from Moscow became a race against the advancing winter. In normal years, autumn in this part of Russia might offer cold but bearable conditions, with heavy snow not arriving until November. In 1812, winter came early. By late October, snowstorms began to sweep across the countryside. Temperatures dropped to levels that froze water in canteens overnight. Soldiers still wore their summer uniforms, many in thin coats or even shirts without proper gloves or boots. The leather in their shoes stiffened and cracked, leaving feet exposed to the cold. Those who managed to scavenge furs or thick clothing from abandoned villages had a better chance of survival, but most were not so lucky. The human body can adapt to cold when it is gradual, but the sudden plunge into extreme temperatures shocked the men. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Many soldiers could no longer hold their weapons or walk without stumbling. Horses, already weakened from lack of forage, began to die in the thousands. Their frozen carcasses were sometimes cut open by desperate soldiers who took the meat for food, while others used the hides as makeshift blankets. The army's supply wagons could not keep up, and in many cases, they were abandoned when horses collapsed. Food ran out, and hunger combined with cold to weaken the army even further. Napoleon had underestimated not only the severity of Russian winter temperatures, but also the effect of wind and exposure on men who were constantly on the move. Marching in sub-zero conditions meant that sweat from exertion froze against the skin. Clothing that became wet from snow or river crossings turned into a deadly trap, drawing heat away from the body. At night, soldiers tried to sleep in the open or huddle around campfires, but wood was scarce in many areas, and strong winds often blew fires out. Men who lay down to rest sometimes never woke up. The psychological impact of the cold was as damaging as the physical. The French army had been made up of veterans who were confident in their ability to endure hardship, but nothing in their past experience matched the relentless Russian winter. Each morning, survivors woke to find comrades frozen stiff beside them. The endless white landscape made navigation difficult, and in snowstorms, entire units became separated. Rumors spread of Russian forces shadowing the retreat, ready to strike the moment the French became too weak to resist. The constant threat of attack added to the exhaustion, as soldiers were forced to march long hours and keep watch even when their bodies demanded rest. The cold also affected the functioning of weapons and equipment. Muskets misfired when powder became damp or froze. Metal parts became brittle and could break. Carts and artillery pieces froze to the ground overnight and required great effort to move in the morning. Gunpowder had to be warmed by the body before it would ignite, a dangerous and slow process during combat. These difficulties meant that even when Napoleon's forces engaged the Russians or Cossack raiders, their ability to fight was severely reduced. The severity of the winter was recorded by survivors who spoke of temperatures so low that wine turned solid in bottles and ink froze in pens. Estimates suggest that in late November, the mercury fell to -20 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit, and by early December it dropped even further. Such temperatures were dangerous for anyone without proper shelter and clothing, but for men already weakened by hunger and fatigue, they were deadly. Frostbite could set in within minutes, and hypothermia claimed thousands of lives. The early arrival of winter meant that rivers and streams froze sooner than expected, altering the routes the army could take. While frozen rivers sometimes offered easier crossings, they also made it possible for Russian forces to pursue more directly. The Berezina River crossing in late November became one of the most infamous episodes of the retreat. In freezing temperatures, Napoleon's engineers built makeshift bridges under constant attack. Soldiers waiting to cross stood for hours in the cold, many collapsing before reaching the other side. In this campaign, the weather did not act as a passive backdrop, it became an active enemy. The French had faced cold before in other campaigns, but always with time to prepare and with supply lines close at hand. In Russia, the combination of extended distance, lack of shelter, and early winter created a perfect storm of suffering. The belief that winter would not arrive until December was rooted in past patterns, but those patterns were not fixed. The winter of 1812 was unusually early and harsh, even by Russian standards, and the French army had no contingency for such conditions. Napoleon's own movements during the retreat reflected the growing desperation. He abandoned the main army in early December to return to Paris, leaving command to Marshal Ney and others. By then, the once grand army that had entered Russia with over 600,000 men was reduced to a fraction of its original size. The survivors who made it back to friendly territory were scarred both physically and mentally by what they had endured. The majority of those lost were not killed in battle but fell to hunger, disease, and above all, the cold. If Napoleon had truly understood the Russian winter, he might have altered his strategy perhaps by bringing more supplies, equipping his men with winter gear, or avoiding deep penetration into Russian territory so late in the year. But his confidence in a swift victory and his reliance on past seasonal expectations left him blind to the risk. The Russian commanders, by contrast, understood the value of time. By retreating and refusing decisive battle, they ensured that Napoleon would be caught far from his supply bases when the weather turned. The climate then did what no army in Europe had yet managed. It broke Napoleon's Grande. Military discipline played a central role in how soldiers experienced hardship in the field, especially during times of extreme cold, scarcity, or prolonged exposure to the elements. In an army, discipline is not just a matter of saluting, wearing the uniform correctly, or following marching orders. It is the glue that holds the structure together, ensuring that thousands of individuals act as one unit, often in dangerous and chaotic situations. The chain of command, the hierarchy from the highest-ranking officers down to the lowest-ranking privates, exists to keep that structure functioning without hesitation. Orders are expected to be followed immediately, not questioned, because hesitation can mean failure in battle or even loss of life. This system, while effective in combat situations, can create serious problems when soldiers face crises that are not purely about fighting an enemy. Imagine a group of soldiers stationed in freezing weather with thin coats, worn boots, and no immediate prospect of resupply. The human instinct in such a case would be to seek warmth by finding shelter, building better fires, or even leaving the assigned post to look for extra blankets or clothing. But military discipline does not allow soldiers to simply leave their stations. No matter how desperate the situation, orders often specify exactly where a soldier should be, when they should be there, and what they should be doing. Abandoning that post, even for survival reasons, could be treated as desertion or dereliction of duty, both of which carry heavy punishments. The chain of command also means that solutions to problems like lack of clothing or food have to pass through layers of authority. A soldier might tell a sergeant that they are freezing. The sergeant might report it to a lieutenant. The lieutenant might have to wait for approval from a captain or major before anything is done. By the time an order for more supplies is processed, the situation may already have worsened. This slow-moving system works fine for planned operations, but in fast-moving crises, it can fail the individual soldier. Supplies in a military are usually distributed based on regulations, schedules, and official counts of what each unit is supposed to have. This is called a logistics system. In theory, it ensures that every soldier gets the same fair share. In practice, it often runs into flaws, especially in harsh conditions or during wartime shortages. If the official paperwork says a unit already has enough winter coats, it might not receive more even if the coats are old, torn, or lost. The supply officers might not see the actual state of the equipment, only the numbers on a report. In many historical cases, soldiers endured bitter cold because the system could not adapt to their real needs. For example, in the winter campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, troops sometimes had to march through snow with rags wrapped around their feet. because boots had worn out and replacements were stuck far behind the front lines. In the First World War, soldiers in the trenches sometimes had extra socks or dry boots stored only a few yards away in a supply depot. But distribution schedules and rigid procedures meant those items were not handed out until the proper day. In some armies, the responsibility for issuing supplies was so strictly guarded that a quartermaster would rather follow regulations than hand out an item without the right paperwork. Even if soldiers were suffering frostbite, the strict system also meant that those most in need were not always prioritized. Supplies might be distributed evenly across all units, regardless of the conditions they faced. A unit stationed in a sheltered area could receive the same number of blankets as a unit posted on a windswept ridge in the dead of winter. The logic was that equality in distribution preserved fairness and avoided disputes between units. However, in terms of survival and efficiency, this one-size-fits-all approach often left the most exposed soldiers in real danger. Discipline also influenced how soldiers behaved toward their own needs. In civilian life, if you are cold and hungry, you find a way to warm yourself and get food. In the military, personal needs are expected to be secondary to the mission. A soldier might be shivering in place but told to remain silent and hidden to avoid giving away their position. They might have food in their pack, but be ordered not to eat until a specific time. The belief is that strict control prevents chaos and keeps the unit focused. But in freezing weather, this can mean hours of unnecessary suffering, which can lead to health issues like hypothermia. There is also a psychological layer to military discipline. From the day they enlist, soldiers are trained to obey without hesitation. This conditioning is what makes them act instantly under fire, yet it can also make them reluctant to take initiative, even when it might save their lives. A soldier might see a pile of unused coats in a nearby tent, but decide not to take one without permission, fearing punishment. In some cases, this obedience comes from respect for authority, in others, from fear of the consequences. Either way, the result is the same. Supplies that could help may go unused, because no one dares to break the rules. The problem is not only about obedience, but also about the culture of the army. In many armies there is a strong sense of pride in following orders to the letter, even in hardship. A soldier who improvises might be seen as resourceful in civilian life, but in the military they could be seen as insubordinate. This cultural mindset reinforces the idea that discipline matters more than comfort, and sometimes more than safety. Officers might view soldiers who complain about the cold as weak or uncommitted, even if the complaints are entirely justified. There are documented moments in military history where soldiers endured unnecessary suffering because the chain of command refused to alter plans. In the winter of 1944-1945, during the Battle of the Bulge, Allied troops were caught in extreme cold. Some commanders delayed ordering winter gear forward because they believed the battle would be over quickly. That decision, made high in the chain of command, meant that soldiers on the ground fought in snow and freezing rain with inadequate clothing for days. Even when supplies arrived, distribution took time, and in those days frostbite injuries climbed sharply. Military discipline also affects how help from outside sources is handled. In some cases, civilians living near military camps or battlefields offered soldiers extra blankets, coats, or food. While this might seem like a blessing, soldiers often needed official permission to accept it. Commanders worried that accepting supplies outside official channels could cause dependence, create unfair advantages between units, or even lead to security risks. There were also fears that supplies could be sabotaged, so, even in the presence of help, rules could stand in the way of relief. In the strictest armies, punishments for breaking discipline were harsh. A soldier caught leaving their post, even to find food or shelter, could face court. In extreme cases, desertion could be punishable by death. The severity of these punishments meant that most soldiers chose to endure the cold rather than take the risk. This fear kept units together, but often at a terrible human cost. The irony is that discipline, which is designed to protect the army's strength, can weaken it under certain conditions. Soldiers weakened by hunger, frostbite, or illness are less effective in combat. If enough soldiers fall sick, the unit's ability to fight is reduced. Yet, because discipline is such a core value, it is often maintained even when it harms overall readiness. The chain of command may recognize the harm too late, by which time the damage is already done. In some armies, lower-ranking officers or non-commissioned officers, NCOs, tried to find ways around the system without openly breaking it. A sergeant might quietly arrange for his men to rotate into a warmer area without officially calling it leaving post. A lieutenant might request extra supplies under another pretense, such as saying equipment was damaged in action, rather than worn out. These acts of quiet bending of the rules were often the only way soldiers received help in time. However, they depended entirely on the personalities of the officers and their willingness to take small risks for their men. If we picture a specific moment, say, a squad of soldiers on night watch in a snowstorm, it becomes clear how discipline shapes every decision. They might be guarding a road, with orders to watch for enemy movement. Their uniforms are thin, their gloves worn. A barn with a warm fire is visible 100 yards away, but they stay in position because the order was to guard the road. Even if frostbite sets in, they will not move without an officer's command. The supply truck with better coats is stuck somewhere behind the lines, and the official distribution is planned for next week. By then, several men may be too sick to stand watch at all. This combination of rigid hierarchy, strict adherence to rules, and inflexible supply systems creates a situation where the survival instincts of individual soldiers are often suppressed. In a civilian setting, adapting quickly to conditions is considered smart. In the military, adapting without orders can be considered a violation. The difference is rooted in the belief that unity and order are more important than the needs of any one person. While this belief has real benefits in battle, it can make crises caused by nature such as freezing weather much harder to survive. I can expand this further by weaving in specific, vivid historical parallels to make the atmosphere more immersive and give you over 1,400 words of flowing narrative, while keeping it suitable for a voiceover. Do you want me to deepen this with case studies from different wars, like Napoleon's retreat from Moscow or trench warfare winters, so the listener feels the full weight of these situations? The combination of starvation, fatigue, and constant exposure to freezing temperatures slowly broke the soldiers down, both in body and mind. The front was not just a battlefield of bullets and shells, it was a place where the weather itself acted like an invisible enemy. The cold was relentless. It did not charge at them or announce itself. It simply seeped into their bones, drained their strength, and turned every movement into an exhausting struggle. Even without an enemy attack, men collapsed in the snow and never stood up again. The cold was everywhere, inside their boots, inside their coats, even inside their thoughts. At first, the soldiers tried to fight it with whatever they had: extra rags stuffed into their boots, scarves tied too tightly around their faces, fires built whenever they could risk the smoke being seen. But the wind cut through clothing as if it wasn't there. Snow soaked into their uniforms and froze solid, leaving them stiff and heavy. Breathing the frigid air felt like swallowing shards of glass. A simple trip to fetch water or gather supplies became a trial of endurance. Each step burned the muscles and numbed the feet until they could not be felt at all. Hunger made everything worse. Supplies were scarce. The soldiers often survived on a crust of stale bread, a thin soup of melted snow, or whatever scraps they could find. Some boiled strips of leather from their gear to soften them enough to chew. Without proper food, their bodies weakened quickly. Their faces grew hollow, their hands trembled, and their movements slowed. Hunger stole their energy, making even basic survival tasks like clearing snow from trenches or carrying ammunition feel like impossible chores. Fatigue followed close behind. It was not just tiredness from a day's work, it was a deep exhaustion that sleep could not fix. The men would close their eyes for a few minutes, only to wake colder than before. Rest became dangerous, because the more they sat still, the more the cold took hold. The combination of exhaustion and hunger lowered their ability to fight off illness. Frostbite was a constant threat. Fingers and toes would first lose feeling, then turn pale or gray. At that point, the damage was often irreversible. Men had to watch as their own skin turned black, their flesh dying while still attached to them. The pain could be unbearable, but sometimes frostbite was painless at first, tricking them into thinking they were fine until it was too late. Hypothermia struck silently as well. A soldier might start shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard it hurt. But then the shivering would stop, not because he was better, but because his body was giving up. His mind would grow cloudy, his speech slurred. Soon he would feel warm, even in the bitter cold, and begin removing layers of clothing in a dangerous, confused state. These conditions claimed more lives than bullets or artillery shells. In some areas, entire units were reduced to half their size without ever engaging in major combat. The front lines were littered with makeshift graves for those who had frozen during the night or collapsed during a march. The men began to fear the nights more than the fighting. In the darkness, with the wind howling and the snow swirling, they could not see the enemy, but they could feel the cold, pressing in from every side. waiting for someone to let down their guard for just a moment. The mental toll was just as severe. Constant exposure to danger and discomfort frayed the soldiers' nerves. It was not a single moment of terror like an artillery barrage, but a slow grinding down of hope. Waking up each morning knowing that you had survived the night only meant facing the same misery again. Conversations became shorter. Laughter, once common among soldiers in lighter moments, grew rare. Eyes looked dull and voices carried no energy. The will to keep going came less from belief in victory and more from simple stubbornness. A refusal to give the cold the satisfaction of winning. Some soldiers began to withdraw into themselves, speaking less and less, their thoughts trapped in a loop of hunger and cold. Others became irritable and short-tempered, lashing out at comrades over small mistakes. Friendships strained under the pressure, but they were also a lifeline. Sharing a scrap of bread or helping someone rub warmth into frozen hands could mean the difference between life and death. Small acts of kindness carried great weight, because they reminded the men that they were still human, not just frozen shells waiting for the inevitable. Sleep deprivation only deepened the psychological strain. Guard shifts had to be maintained through the night. No matter how cold it became, those not on watch tried to rest, but the howling wind, the distant echoes of gunfire, and the constant shivering made real sleep nearly impossible. Dreams, when they came, were often about warmth, sunlit fields, hot meals, or beds with thick blankets. Waking from such dreams into the freezing dark was a cruel jolt that left some men quietly crying into their scarves so no one would hear. The body's slow breakdown mirrored the mind's decline. Cuts and scrapes, which would normally heal quickly, stayed open and raw in the cold, often becoming infected. Teeth ached from the chill, gums bleeding from scurvy due to lack of fresh food. Even speaking could hurt. As lips cracked and bled from dryness, men learned to move carefully, not because they feared injury from the enemy, but because they knew even a small wound could turn deadly without proper care. Clothing, once seen as protection, became another burden. Uniforms stiff with frozen sweat and snow rubbed the skin raw. Boots soaked through from marching in deep snow froze overnight, forcing soldiers to thaw them with their own body heat in the morning before they could put them on. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed with the smell of damp wool and leather, creating a heavy, oppressive air in shelters. Washing was almost impossible, as water froze too quickly, and stripping down to clean oneself risked frostbite. Despite all this, orders still had to be followed. Soldiers marched through waist-deep snow, carried heavy equipment over icy terrain, and dug trenches in ground so frozen that picks and shovels bounced off it. Some tasks were almost absurd in their difficulty, like trying to pitch a tent in a snowstorm with numb fingers, or lighting a fire when every scrap of wood was wet. The cold turned every simple act into a battle of its own. Morale suffered greatly. Letters from home could lift spirits for a time, but they also reminded the men of what they had lost. The memory of warm meals, soft beds, and family gatherings was almost painful in its sharp contrast to their current reality. Some tried to block those thoughts entirely, focusing only on the immediate task in front of them. Others clung to memories as a form of escape, telling stories around small fires, voices low to conserve heat and to keep from drawing attention. In the end, the cold shaped the soldiers' lives more than the enemy did. It was a constant presence, a silent predator that claimed victims slowly and without mercy. There were no medals for surviving another freezing night, no recognition for walking miles on frozen feet that no longer felt like part of your body. The struggle against the cold was invisible in reports and records, but it was the daily reality for those who lived it. The war may have been fought with guns and steel, but for many, it was the cold that decided whether they lived to see another day.